Hey, everybody. So after that very nice introduction, I'm not going to talk at all about those things. And instead, I'm going to talk about a project that I'm doing with Professor David O'Sullivan at Wellington University of Victoria. They just changed their name. So if I got that wrong, I apologize to him, but he's not here, so too bad. So you can see the title here, and this is in the background, the board game Pandemic, for those of you that don't know. It's a fun co-op game about viruses spiraling out of control and destroying the world. I thought it was a bit on the nose to start there. So basically, this is how the talk's going to proceed. First, I'm going to give some really obvious examples of how ideology can impact board games, and then shift to suggest that there's an underlying sort of more subtle shaping that occurs through the core game mechanics, and that those mechanics shape not only the cartographic space of the boards, but also the implicit ideological decision spaces of the games themselves, and thus one could sort of argue the players. So let's start with something pretty terrible. This is Victory Over Communism, an all-American game. And you can sort of see that the ideology in this game is pretty obvious. It tells you what's going to happen in the title. Cartographically, the map in the center is kind of interesting. The game space is actually just those rows of codes on the outside, which refer to questions that you ask the player about how awesome the US is and how evil communism is to be able to continue moving. But inside, there's a fairly basic world map. And the imaginary of this game is the world struggle against communism, but the play space itself is separated off. This, if it's not really obvious, is an incredibly bad game. Did my next slide come up? There we go. But picking on poorly designed propaganda while fun isn't actually the point of this talk. Instead, I want to focus on the ways that even in games widely lauded for their design, ideological decisions can shape how space is modeled, in turn influencing both the cartographic space of the game and the decision-making space of the players. I should note that all of the images here come from Board Game Geek or my own or David's personal collection. So here's Volko Ruhnke's Labyrinth, The War on Terror, 2001 to question mark. This game is significantly more influential than its popularity might suggest, as its lineage, as it is the direct lineage of the coin system, and thus of modern asymmetric titles like Root, and they can be traced directly back to them in their design diaries. This game takes aim at an ideological struggle and models it for one or two players, with the sides being the United States versus the global jihadists, who are heavily tied to, but not explicitly or exclusively, Al-Qaeda. Its tie to ideology should perhaps not be that surprising, given that the game's own promotional material makes reference to Fukuyama's end of history theory, and perhaps most importantly, that the designer is a CIA national security analyst. It's also worth noting here that Mark Herman, who collaborates on Ruhnke's later Fire in the Lake, has done DoD consulting, and that the ties between board games and the Department of Defense and CIA goes back quite a long way. So here is actually Root, which hopefully some of you have played. It's a great game. I have it here. And there's this line from Labyrinth to these cute and fuzzy woodland creatures duking it out in a forest. We're not imagining this. Cole, the designer, has explicitly stated this. He's an exceptional designer, and I recommend going and checking him out. So what we're sort of arguing here in these games, you can see the cartographic imaginary are these interconnected points that get filled with stuff. And in this talk, we're going to outline three dominant mechanics for designers in board games. These aren't exclusive. This is the beginning of a very large project between David and I, we hope. We'll give examples of how these influence the modeling of space and thus the cartographic imaginaries of the boards. Our typology is not the only one. So many games blend and mix between these mechanics and these types of spaces, both decision and cartographic. However, it's a short talk. We want to show some general contours of the board gaming world on a Friday afternoon at the end of a really amazing conference. So on the left, we have Aware and Backgammon here. There's not much more to these games than movement across abstract spaces, right? You go point to point, each space represents an area, you move to and from those areas. Even if these early movement games, we also see elements of area control and intersection between spaces, right? You can block people out of spaces, and you can, where your tokens are shifts and relates to other spaces as well. So on here, there's an obligatory comment about Monopoly as a direct ripoff of Maggie's Game, as explained in numerous podcasts, and Mary Pyland's The Monopolist, which is a great book. Let's see, for those unfamiliar with the history, Maggie's a Quaker. She made up the landlord's game to sort of actually point out the problems of capitalism. That players are supposed to go bankrupt and lose their homes with one player winning. Pyland's The Monopolist goes into detail on how basically this design was appropriated and the message inverted. But again here, and on the right is Rat Race. This is, according to David, it's a game of life equivalent. But Rat Race has divorce, which was wildly adventurous in Catholic 1970s Northern Ireland. David notes that. I did not grow up in 1970s Northern Ireland. But again, we see here that the mechanics of the game are meant to tell us something about the world it models and abstracts, whether you include divorce or not, whether people go bankrupt and lose their homes or not. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about war games and their influence. So these are kind of proto-war games. They're all about movement and position. Go is purely about position and area control, while chess, the board regulates movement and area control. Both are based on a square grid, although it's worth noting that Go uses the intersections, not the spaces. And the reason I point out that square grids are important is because while we're going to spend a bit of time talking about the Prussian Kriegspiel in a minute, I want to jump ahead to commercial war games. There are a few before Gettysburg, which you see here on the left, most notably probably Tactics and Tactics 2. But Gettysburg was the first one to make a kind of big cultural impact and set off that kind of first late 70s, early 80s explosion of war games. What's interesting here is that in the first edition on the left, you can see that there's a square grid. And in the second edition on the right, which comes out in 61, it's actually been shifted to hexes. So this is the first hex encounter game, which became kind of a norm that you see up through, say, modern Euros like Settlers of Catan. So the important thing that I want to point out here is the way they work. Terrain types create movement constraints and movement costs. They have an effect on combat and zones of control. Later, you'll see the introduction of edges in these spaces, which is rivers, for example, following hex edges, but not running through them. So you see a distortion of the space. This is a model of the world. It's a model of how war works that creates a specific type of decision space in terms of how one imagines war. And they get pretty sophisticated. This is the War of the Ring, SPI's 1977 version. I believe this is actually a photo of David's copy. Obviously, this is a fantasy representation in a fairly flexible system, but it's still ultimately conflict between groups played out over space with constraints on how you move through them. So if you kind of look on the board there, you can actually see those rivers running along the edges of hexes and so on. One of probably the most beautiful and classic of these is Redmond Simonson's 1983 Sicily, The Race for Messina. Unfortunately, this image is not at a particularly high resolution, and neither of us owns a copy of this. This is from that golden age of war games I mentioned that ends kind of in the mid-'80s with the rise of computer games and stuff like SSI, which is so that's strategic simulations and coming out of like Avalon Hill and SPI. This is where hex map and art got to. This is like basically the limits that they could get. And those limits are actually a function of printing technology at the time. Modern maps for war games may look better, but from a design perspective, this is actually a really interesting and important, but still ultimately hex-based design. There's also lots of really ugly ones. This is Blood on the Snow. This is the Finnish-Russian War, and all the terrain is basically the same because they decided to use this horrible fill. So I want to return here to the Prussian Kriegspiel, which is a 19th century game. It's a precursor to kind of modern games in a lot of ways, including sort of tabletop games like Warhammer 40K and the like. It was played on actual maps with movement regulated by measuring tapes and umpires. The grids of commercial games are in a way there to avoid the necessity of umpires and allow movement and combat to be regulated by relatively simple rules. So recently, a small number of games have returned to systems more akin to this, with the mechanisms of movement cleverly managed by an analysis of the landscape as a series of positions that might be taken up by armies. This is probably most obviously seen in Rachel Simmons' Guns of Gettysburg, which is an absolute masterpiece. And if you look at that board on the right, you can see those lines represent where the armies can move, and those are different distances based on her analysis of how easy or hard it is to move across that land for an army. It's a map where linear positions are demarcated based on affordances. The units sit on those lines between circles. Those are positions that they can occupy. She developed this based on a dissatisfaction of the hex grid and the flattening that happens when you force things into a specific shape. But in warfare at this time, she notes that it's about linear arrangements of formations. So you need to consider what positions the terrain provides in relation to these standard formations. Simmons' design points to what is really going on here. The map board is a complex analysis of the affordances of the landscape in relation to movement and combat. Hex grids are too, but they're a bit more formulaic. See what's next. Oh, this is just sort of thrown in because it's not Risk. Also, it's an awesome box cover, and it's a very, very different geopolitics than we see in most games. That's a lot to get into in a 10-minute talk, but they really wanted it there, so my apologies. So this is Endeavor, the game I happen to have behind me. I have the old first edition. There's a new edition out now. It's sort of this weird hybrid where a navigator's map sheets are overlapping on a table to convey very explicitly the colonial world at a range of scales in a semi-abstract way. And this shows how places get reduced to spaces that interconnect along defined vertices with other spaces in order here to exert control, model trade, and the like. Endeavor is actually probably most famous for the way that it handles slavery in the game, where actually early on, it can be really, really good for your economy, but then eventually it turns on you and you get punished for it in the later, more modern period. I'll return to some of those ideological implications later. I just wanted to note that here. Here we have Cuddle Tear on the left and El Grande on the right. A side note for those of us that love The Witcher, Gwent in the game Witcher 3, and also when it was released as its own standalone game, was inspired by Cuddle Tear, according to the designers. So if you want to go back and check out the inspiration. 2 minutes, right? Okay. And El Grande is just an absolute classic. Here we see area control works often over politically defined units into which we place our resources, workers, and the like. You can almost read these as choroplus in a sense, which you actually get a sense of here with Tammany Hall. And then on the right, we have Chaos in the Old World. Tammany Hall is a kind of hybrid. Workers are election agents, and they hold influence with immigrants and present inwards in combination with a bidding process to determine control. So it's like a combination between worker placement and area majority control. More area control, and just as with the War of the Rings, you can see that this mechanic doesn't need to be restricted to what we'd imagine as real spaces. On the right is Chaos in the Old World, which I also have somewhere behind me, which is a fantastic if dark game. And I want to note here that it's much like the rest of society. Chaos in the Old World is one of the few prominent games designed by a Black designer, Eric Lang, and I wanted to call that out as important. And while not the focus of this talk, a depressing number of other areas of games are made by basically cis white male voices. So if you look at worker placement, which is where I'm going to wrap up, you can see a transformation from what was a map to sort of aerial-ish units of regions to spaces set over an illustrated landscape. And here we have viticulture, where you make wine in pre-modern Tuscany. You have a set of numbers of workers. They're assigned to spaces. Other workers may or may not be able to occupy them as well. Stone Age really draws this out. This isn't a map, it's of a place. It's some other species of thing. This board is map-like, but the spatial relations aren't the way they work in a traditional map, except insofar as there are spaces on them, sites which you choose, at which you choose your actions. I'm running out of time. I apologize. This is Agricola, a much more complicated worker placement game. And what's important for our purposes is the altering of spatial relations that happens here. Workers are placed in nodes, and these nodes have relations to those around them in terms of how they execute and influence other actions moving forward. But they're ultimately not geographic in their model. This is sort of the core point of our talk. And unfortunately, I've sort of run out of time. This is a very scattershot look at three main core mechanics, what they represent in terms of how the game world works, and what sorts of boards this ends up creating. It's early on in a project, and there are many, many more themes for us to really look into. However, we're in a so-called golden age of board games, where they haven't really been more popular for the past 50 years or ever. These boards are not neutral. They present specific idealized spaces and specific idealized relations of power. In Puerto Rico, which is on the right, but not covered here, for example, when you need more workers, you go and get brown cubes to work your computations from the ship on the harbor. That's all that's addressed there. That's perhaps the most obvious example, but there are many others. Games are used by major corporations and defense departments to model interactions. So the ways that these mechanics model the world has very real implications. And I'm going to replace Puerto Rico here with Spirit Island here, which some of you may be familiar with, but is actually a so-called anti-colonial game. But it's also one of the first steps in what needs to be a longer process, because the Spirit Island is not about the people themselves or communities working together. It's about sort of deities. So there's still an abstraction that disconnects the space of the game with the ideology that it's presented. And with that, I'm done, and I'd love to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. There are many questions for you in the Slack channel, but I don't think we have time right now to answer
No
them.
worries.